My name is Rick Archer. I'm with Overland Partners Architects, and I'm assuming that you all are docents here at the Wildflower Center. Is that true for all of you? Docents, maybe some staff? First of all, I want to thank you all for what you do, because without the docents, this place would not work. It is designed to require people to be hands-on as a part of the experience. It doesn't stand alone, and we knew that when we were designing it. And so without you, the design that we envisioned would not work. And so a hearty thanks from all of us. Before I get into really talking specifically about the design of the Wildflower Center and some of the things that we were thinking about as we were designing it, and some of the questions you may get asked by people, people often ask how we got selected to do this, and so I wanted to tell you a little bit about our firm and about the selection process. And today, we're an architecture firm based in San Antonio. Today, we're the largest architecture firm in the city. We employ about 60 people. We do work all across the United States, from California to Pennsylvania, Montana to Texas, and we've currently worked in or working in China, India, Africa, South America, Mexico, and as I mentioned, all across the U.S. So that's where we are today. But now we're going to go back and look back at 1991, I guess, when we were first contacted by the Wildflower Center. I have had at the time 3 partners, and we had been students together at the University of Texas, had this dream of starting an architecture firm, and so we embarked off to different places around the United States and got experience, and then came back to San Antonio in 1987. We had graduated in the late 70s, early 80s, and about 7 years later came back, started Overland Partners, and really, you know, it was a pretty tough time to start an architecture firm. For those of you who remember 1987, the stock market crashed. The federal government was the largest landowner in the state of Texas. There was not a whole lot going on in real estate. And for us, our experience had been largely working in commercial real estate, doing speculative office buildings and large high-rise buildings, and for firms like IMPay, who you've probably heard of. And so we arrived in San Antonio, and we just kind of looked at each other and said, what are we doing now? Hey, that's much better. We went into a period of time when we were interviewed by the Business Journal in San Antonio, because I think we were the only business started in San Antonio that year. And they wanted to know why we were crazy enough to actually start a business in 1987. And the reporter asked us what style of architecture we did. And one of my partners, without missing a beat, said survivalist. And in other words, if you needed it, we did it, because we had no work, and you saw my family up there earlier. I've got 5 kids. We had a lot of mouths to feed, and none of us are independently wealthy. So it was definitely a figure it out day by day. And in either 1990 or 1991, somewhere around there, we got a call from the Wildflower Center asking us to submit our credentials for the design of the center. And they were, at the time, I think, talking to 75 firms nationwide. Needless to say, we were a little floored that we were on the list, particularly when we saw the list that included many of the people that we had studied in our textbooks, professors that we'd had in school, people we'd heard lecture, and then there was Overland Partners, and who were they? We decided that we would have a lot of fun with it, because, great, we knew that there was absolutely no chance that we were going to be selected. So it was going to be a great opportunity to meet Lady Bird Johnson if we got that far. And so we submitted our credentials, which weren't much, but basically wrote a letter that said how excited we'd be to work with the center and about how we might think about the design. Well, Dee Dee Rose, who was the building committee chairman, called me right, gosh, when was it? I think in November of '91, and said that we had made the shorter list of, I believe it was 11 firms that they were going to visit. And they were going to visit a building site of a completed project. And I remember getting off the phone and telling my partners, I said, I've got great news. We actually made the list for the Wildflower Center. We're still in consideration. And I said, but I kind of have bad news. And they were like, what's that? And I said, well, they want to visit one of our projects. And we had, at that point, only completed one project. And so then I said, but there's good news because we don't have to figure out which one we're going to take them to. And the project that we took him to was a $32 a square foot, $32 a square foot apartment complex. And it was built out in the Texas Hill Country for a group of scientists at the Texas Research Park. And I remember we were a little apprehensive. We were going to meet Mrs. Johnson, and the committee came out and toured the project with us. And several things stood out from that time. One, it was in the Texas Hill Country, and we had preserved the trees and built the building around it, building with native stone and metal and things that were indigenous to Texas. But I think several things got us to the next level. First of all, Mrs. Johnson, who you all who knew her know, she's very frugal. $32 a square foot sounded perfect. And the second thing was that when we were out there, she came upon this enormous oak tree that was in the middle of the complex, and she heard bees in the tree. And I remember she walked up there and she said, "You saved the bees." And we were like, "Yeah, the bees." We were like, had no idea there were bees in this tree. And you're like, yeah, we saved the bees. And then the third thing was that we learned afterwards that she was legally blind. So she couldn't really even see our project, which was probably a good thing. But I think the bees, $32 a square foot, and her eyesight got us to the next step. When we went in for the interview, I believe they interviewed 5 firms, and it was a who's who of architects around the country. And we were more than a little intimidated. They'd already seen the only project we had to show them, so there wasn't a whole lot that we could do at the interview. And so we decided we're just going to go and have fun. All of us went, pretty much the entire office, and we thought about what would we show them. And one of the things that one of my partners, in fact, was talking about this yesterday. He said there's 2 kinds of people. There's the people who walk into the room and they say, "Look at me." And there's the people who walk into the room and they say, "There you are." And he said, we're all attracted to the "there you are" kind of people, not the "look at me" kind of people. And so we decided that we had nothing to talk about ourselves about, and we would just talk about the Wildflower Center and what we might do if we were hired. And so we thought that the best way to do that would be to show indigenous Texas buildings in beautiful fields of wildflowers, and that would be our inspiration, and that we would talk about how we would use that to create this place. Well, you know, that was before the days of Google and the internet and being able to find things easily. And so the big question was, where are we going to find those images? And after a very thorough search of everything we could think of, we were at the Wildflower Center over on the east side of Austin one day in their double-wide trailers, and they had this slide library. And I went into the librarian and I said, and I started looking at these slides, and they were amazing. They were just phenomenal photographs of Texas wildflowers and indigenous Texas buildings. And I said to the librarian, I said, could I borrow some of your slides for a couple of weeks? And she goes, I don't know, why not? No one ever uses them. No one's ever asked me to borrow slides. And so we took the slides and we did our entire presentation from slides that we took from the Wildflower Center's library. And when we finished, one of the members of the committee said, those are the most beautiful images of wildflowers and of indigenous Texas buildings I have ever seen. Where in the world did you get them? And I blushed, I know, and I said, from your library. And Mrs. Johnson, in her inimitable way, said, well, they're very resourceful. And needless to say, when we were selected, we were shocked. And Dee Dee Rose called me to tell me. And I remember asking her, I said, why in the world did you pick us? I said, I would never have picked us. And she said, we just thought you'd be fun to work with. And, that has really stuck with us. And I would say it has shaped our practice as much as anything. Is that what we realize is that as architects, you think that you have to go out and impress people and it's what you've done. But really, it's about entering into a relationship. And so now we're in 2010. That was 1992. I've now been in an 18-year relationship, 18-year love affair with the Wildflower Center. So let's talk a little bit about the project. When we were given the program for the Wildflower Center, a program is a document that spells out everything that goes in the building. And it was prepared beforehand and given to us. And what was envisioned here was a 3-story building surrounded by gardens. And we looked at it and said, it just doesn't feel right. It isn't about a building or about the buildings. It's about what's between the buildings. And so we took that program and we just split it apart and said, let's make a series of little buildings that would define outdoor spaces and create what really became a village. The site, as we found it, was this almost 40-acre swath of land. This is Mopac and La Crosse. Of course, the Veloway was not there at the time. We didn't own and still don't own this out parcel here, but running through the middle of it was a critical water quality zone. And that meant that the water that ran off there was going immediately into karst features and sinkholes that went directly into the Edwards Aquifer. Very, very sensitive piece of landscape. We had no room to build, obviously, on the north side of it, so that meant that we had to be on the south side of the critical water quality zone. At the time we came, the property ended right here. And we convinced the Wildflower Center that they needed to buy 5 more acres because there wasn't adequate room between the critical water quality zone and the fence to build a building without really encroaching. These trees right here are the big oak trees just outside of the auditorium, just to kind of put things in perspective. This is what we called the veil of oak trees that you enter through. And there was this one spot in the landscape that was clear where we could put this village. And so we began to try to figure out how we would fit it in here. I'll never forget our first meeting with Mrs. Johnson. We said to her, this is your vision. The Wildflower Center is your baby. It's not ours. So we're just your architects. We're here to serve you. What do you want this to be? And she stopped and she thought about it for a few minutes, and very earnestly and very carefully she said, well, I just want it to look like God put it there. We're like, oh gosh, we're in trouble. Not only had we gotten this commission, we were supposed to do what God was going to do. But she raised the bar so high, impossibly high. But, as these young architects, we were a little undaunted and we were going to jump as high as we could. We considered options like putting the building on stilts because the land was precious and we shouldn't disturb it. And we explored that for a little while and we kind of said, well, that's not what God would do. He would be bolder than that. He's not afraid of the land. And so really, even though there was no way for us to define what she said, those words began to shape the way we thought and the way we acted. The site then developed, it's about 33,000 square feet of conditioned space, another 19,000 plus or minus of unconditioned porches, breezeways, pole barns, etc., for a total of about 52,000 square feet on about 40 acres originally. And we designed it around a series of outdoor spaces. Now the first thing was, you'll notice that when you arrive here, you don't arrive at a building. And many people kind of come in and they go, well, where is it? You know, you're greeted by a cistern, not by a building. Well, that was intentional. We thought it was important that the buildings didn't dominate, but that we put a symbol out there that represented what was going on here. And so the collection of water became very important, and I'll talk more about that. Of course, the cistern is here. There's an aqueduct that you walk along, and you come through an archway into your first courtyard. Landscapes throughout history, according to Barbara Solomon, a well-known landscape architect, have really been three kinds: formal, picturesque, and agrarian. And part of what we wanted to do was to demonstrate that you could do all three of those garden types with native plants. Now, a formal garden is defined by being surrounded by colonnades, by perhaps a central water feature. It doesn't mean it's symmetrical. And so this entry court is a formal garden in the historic sense of the term. At the middle of it is a water feature. Not only did we want to show the different ways that you could plant with native landscapes, but we also wanted to demonstrate or illustrate what brings life to plants. And there is no life without water. And so at the center of the first formal courtyard, we put a fountain, and we called it the water court. Around it, you may have noticed that there's a series of rings of stone that are very subtle. Those ripple out from the fountain like you dropped a pebble into a pond. And the thought there was that metaphorically, this very small movement that was the Wildflower Center would have ripple effects out into the world. And so we patterned that fountain after Jacob's Well. When you walk into the second court, it's the picturesque garden. Picturesque gardens are more winding and informal in nature. They often have vistas through archways and breezes, which this one has a vista through here. It has a vista through here. It has, they often had tempietos, little temples. And so we asked ourselves, what kind of temple would we put in this garden? And this little silo right here, the idea was that when the seed was collected, harvested each season, that it would be stored in that silo until it was time to plant again. And so the seed silo became, in a sense, a temple to plant life, to the seed. The third area was the agrarian garden, and that's the demonstration plots. People often ask, well, why do we come to this area and have this regular grid? Well, you don't plant farmland in curvy, swervy forms. You plant it in regular forms. And typically, you plant it on the cardinal axes. This is due north. The site and the topography over here lent itself to being slightly northeast. But we returned back to the cardinal axes of the grid. This happens to be the Austin City grid, which is not on the cardinal axes. This is nature's grid. And so farmers have always known that they had to respond to nature's grid and not to an urban pattern. And so we wanted to reflect those in the placement of the buildings and the landscape. And that was about earth. It was about the importance of earth in plant life. And so we said, now we've got three of them. We've got water, seed, earth. What are we missing? We're missing the sun. And how could we do something that would demonstrate the importance of the sun? That's where the tower came from. In the ancient times, that was an axis mundi, a representation of our vertical relationship to the heavens, and the fact that what happens down here couldn't happen without what happens up there, in this case, sunlight and rain. And so the planning of the project was about creating this village around a series of very meaningful and purposeful gardens. And this is just a construction shot. I thought it was interesting to see that during construction, with the exception of the actual area of construction, everything else is completely left native. We made sure that we preserved every single bit of the landscape. And in fact, one of the ways we did that is we put price tags on the trees. And if you think a $30,000 tree is expensive to you, tell that to the backhoe operator. You know, that if you knock that tree down or you damage and kill that tree, it will be $30,000 out of your paycheck. They took that very seriously. And what was fun is to watch the transformation of people who came out here thinking they were building and left here as people who really cared about the environment. Now, as we started thinking about architecture, just as we did think about landscape, we said, well, what are the forces that have shaped buildings in this part of the world? And being from San Antonio, we had to look south a little bit and at the Spanish missions, because obviously all of this was a part of Mexico at one point in time. And we felt that the way they built in the harsh South Texas sun was a great precedent to look at. And so we studied the Spanish missions and felt like at least parts of the buildings might reflect the character that we found in these buildings that were timeless and that we really loved. We also looked carefully at the German settlements. The Germans came after the Spaniards and they inhabited this land. They took the limestone from the ground, where the Spaniards tended to work more in sandstone, both because of geography and because of form. The Germans liked things that were more precise, as Germans would be. I happen to have a lot of German descent. And so they worked in limestone with typically more cut stone, things that were much more finely crafted. And of course, what we think of as the Texas Hill Country was really born out of the German settlers. And so obviously it was important that we reflect that. And then the last vernacular architecture or indigenous architecture of this place is the ranching vernacular. These simple barns with metal siding, metal roofs that really are not just typical of Texas, but if you drive across the United States, you find them everywhere. It is probably the indigenous American architecture. And so we thought it was important that we respond to that heritage as well. And then one of the questions was, okay, how do we do that and weave all of this together and make sense of it? That it isn't just about, you know, like a paper doll putting on different kinds of clothing, but rather how do we make it deeply rooted in this place? And the thing that we came to was that one was that the Spanish buildings were always very solid. They had very tiny windows in them, if any. And so the buildings that were more solid, like the auditorium, made sense to be inspired by the Spanish settlements, by the missions. The more regular architectural buildings like the gallery or the children's house or the gift shop that are still public buildings, it made sense to do in the German style. And then the buildings that are not public buildings, the administrative offices, the laboratories, were the ranching buildings. A little lower quality construction, not intended for the general public to inhabit. And so we set ground rules for what was what. I will tell you, at the beginning, we thought we were going to do it all in limestone. And because this limestone is really from this immediate region. And we had done the drawings, and our mason pulled up to our office with a truck full of stone. And he said, I've been trying to get what you want with this limestone, and it's not working. And he took this truck and he dumped this sandstone out in our parking lot, and he said, I think this is what you're supposed to use. And I remember our landscape architect going, don't do it. That's going to destroy it. It needs to be out of the same thing. And she was adamant about it. But the more we thought about it and the more we saw the mock-ups, we realized that he was right and that we needed to listen to the masons. We had taken them to 17 different sites to look at masonry. And they thought about what we'd shown them and came back and said, you know, the ones that you said were like this, they were all sandstone. They weren't limestone. And so the idea of mixing the stones came from them, and I think it's one of the things that really makes the place special. And then this was the first watercolor rendering that we did of the center. One of the things that people always ask about is the tree on the top of the tower. We've never gotten it, but there is a planter up there. The ancients often would place a tree on the top of their ziggurats because what it did was it spoke to the fact that even though they had built toward the heavens, that nature was still higher than they were. And for us, that seemed important at the Wildflower Center, that nature would surmount architecture. So I'm still hoping that someday we're going to get a tree up there. I'm going to take you on an architect's tour. And we could do this walking, except that it's really hot, and so it's probably better to do it in here. But as I mentioned, you come through the veil of trees, and the first thing that you encounter is this cistern. And the cistern actually is collecting water off of the auditorium. If you look up, you can see the roof is inverted. It's a butterfly roof, and the gutter runs down the middle. We did that intentionally, despite the fact that everyone said it would leak. So far it hasn't. Because we wanted, when you were in here, for you to know that water was being collected, not being shed. And that water goes off to the front of this and then goes down the aqueduct and arrives at this cistern. That cistern is used to irrigate the entry gardens. And part of our concept was that once the plants were established, that the entire botanical garden would be irrigated with collected water and not using any potable water. I think it depends on how much rainfall we get, whether we accomplish that from year to year. But I think it was a noble undertaking. This is actually part of what was at the time North America's largest water harvesting system. It includes a whole series of cisterns, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a little bit. Now, before the place opened, one of the things that we did is we brought all of the architects, our families, our children, and we invited Hal Box, who was the former dean of the School of Architecture, who had kind of incubated Overland Partners, and he and his wife came out. We came out with chisels and mallets, and we knocked the sharp corners off the building. We didn't want it to look like it was brand new. And we, on the cistern, we decided that we would carve symbols into that would be about us, that would be our personal mark as a way for our families and each of us to remember that we had been a part of this. And you know, not that many people know they're there, except you all probably do, because someone's probably shown you. And I was on a tour the other day, and the docent started it there, and she said, you know, if you're going to experience this place properly, you have to learn to look. And she said, so I want you to look around the cistern and see if you can find anything unusual. And then as people started looking, they began to find the symbols, the clover, the nautilus, the sun, that were our way of just kind of signing the building in a very subtle way, but also to show that it was made by hand. As the aqueduct ends, it comes to the entry archway. The water from the auditorium actually splits. Half of it goes toward the cistern, and the other half comes and runs down this thing that we called the mousetrap. And the mousetrap ends in a stone down here and spills into a basin. And the reason that was built was because Texas has aquatic plants. We didn't have an aquatic environment here. There's no stream, there's no running water. And so we wanted to be able to display those plants. And I will tell you that for many years when my kids were young, this was their favorite part of the Wildflower Center. They'd come out here and immediately lie down on their belly. Their hands were in the water. There was dragonflies and tadpoles and frogs and lizards and all the cool stuff that comes with an aquatic environment. And I think this was actually Bob Anderson, our landscape architect's idea, and I think a wonderful contribution to the center. Obviously, we were pretty unabashed in taking our inspiration from ancient history, the Roman aqueducts. And this is where the water comes off the roof. And we, you know, as architects, when you're working on things, you start naming them because you're trying to talk to the people on the team. This became known as the Moses Stone because the water split in two. You know, so I guess it's the Great Red Sea running through there. But, you know, we worked very closely with the masons. Obviously, as architects, you can't draw all these stones. That's an impossibility. And so you're really dependent on the craftsmen to get into the spirit of what you're doing. And so I remember one day we were out here, and there were some masons working on this aqueduct, and our landscape architect walked by, and one of the masons was making sure every piece of stone was dressed perfectly and they were all the same size. And the other mason had this riot of stones going up and down. And Eleanor turned to the one guy who was being very precise, and she just said, "Looks like he's having a lot more fun than you are." We came back later on and he had stones going everywhere, because I mean, we kind of joked if we could have given them each a six-pack of beer when they got started, it would have been even better. Because the challenge with these masons, any mason, is they think, you know, that it has to look like wallpaper. And we said, no, you know, the big stones go at the bottom because they're harder to lift. Save the little stones for the top. You know, use a little artistry. And except for those, yeah, that's about 10,000 pounds worth of stone up there. But that's load bearing, and it had to carry the load of the arch. And I think as you walk around and you look at the stonework, it's really a tour de force. It won the National Masonry Association's award that year for the best masonry in the country. And I think it's unparalleled in new construction today because of its artistry. One of my partners, Bob Shimwell, had built about a 60-foot long, 8-foot tall stone wall at his house growing up. And so we sent him out here, and he worked with the masons and would lay stone and really help them understand the spirit of what we were trying to do. This stone right here, which you can barely see now because the plants have grown up, is a big boulder, and it's hollowed out at the top. When we were doing the construction, one of the trees that we saved, we found this stone under the bough of the tree. And it had been dripping on this stone for 100 years. And it had hollowed it out and created this basin. Well, we knew that it was going to be destroyed during construction, so we took the stone and we set it aside and we saved it in a safe place. And then we kept saying, where are we going to put it, where are we going to put it, where are we going to put it? And then when this fountain idea emerged, we said, that's perfect. You know, it's already made to receive the water. And so that's one of those found and salvaged objects. This is the north side of the auditorium, and I think part of the beauty of this wall is it's just pure and unadulterated stone. We had this idea because the Spaniards often planted things in their stone of creating these little planting pockets, and so as you go around, those are filled with cacti and other plants that are drought tolerant, actually don't need any or much water. And they're again one of the ways that we demonstrate that the plant life is really more important than the buildings themselves. And of course, here we are. One of the things that we wanted to do in here, these little slots of light up here, we were really concerned about this just being a black box. And of course, at the time we did this, the technologies were such that it was tough to project with enough lumens to be able to see anything. So we had to keep it very dark. But we came up with the notion of it's a 2-inch wide gap, and it has pieces of silicone jointed glass on the top of that shed the water. And one of the things that it does is it creates this beautiful light that just grazes the walls, which allows you to really appreciate the workmanship on the stone. And it makes it an environment that you can stay in a lot longer. And without being fatigued. Now this area, which is the pre-function space of the auditorium, we couldn't afford to build a big foyer, so we said let's just build an outdoor space without a roof. And we were pretty unabashed about borrowing our inspiration from Mission San Jose in San Antonio, where the roof had fallen off. And this happens to be one of my favorite parts of the mission. That there is this sort of ruinous quality that makes you uncertain about when the buildings were built. We got a lot of criticism from the architectural community when the building first opened as a result of that. It was accused of being like Disneyland or something. But the interesting thing is it's not at all like Disneyland because it's real. It's made of real stuff, and it actually functions. And we didn't tell the masons to make it look like that. It's the way they built it. And so part of the, I think the beauty of the place is that you really do see the work of the hand. Eventually, architects kind of turned around, and I'll talk a little bit more about how they did. You know, one of the things, and I should have shared this earlier, but I think it was really important. There were many times in the design process when we were challenged to keep going. We were in the middle of SOS really kind of forming, and the fact that we were building on a site with karst features and sinkholes and a critical water quality zone, many of the environmentalists basically said, do not build. And at one point, I remember the board meeting and having to face a lot of criticism about this. And the board very courageously addressed the subject. But I think prior to that, we had laid a foundation for this. And before we started working, we worked with the building committee to craft a mission statement. I'm going to read it to you because I think it really is important in understanding the center. It said, the National Wildflower Research Center proposes to create a new study and visitor center on a 40-acre site southwest of Austin, Texas. This complex should facilitate the center's endeavor to promote knowledge and use of native plant life while demonstrating an ecologically sensitive approach to the development of a site with fragile environmental conditions. The project shall involve total resource conservation and emphasize the primacy of native landscape and its intrinsic beauty. The new center is conceived as a place to meet the operational needs of an emerging national organization, accommodate large crowds for special events when appropriate, and welcome visitors who have made a pilgrimage to the site from across the United States. Should have said the world. As such, the complex shall symbolically protect the natural environment from the public, then through the filter of education and modeling, involve them welcome them into the site with heightened sensitivity, thereby encouraging its preservation. By design and context, the center shall elucidate for the visitor a fundamental understanding of ecological issues, nature, and site-specific environment. And in all ways, the center shall acknowledge the physical and transcendent value of native landscapes, and by extension, the fragile, precious hill country site. So that became a stake in the ground, and everyone agreed to it. So when the environmentalists began to challenge building, they went back and said, to model how we should build on a site with fragile environmental conditions, isn't that what we're doing? And at the time, all of the land around here was platted and permitted for single-family residences. This was the lone parcel of land that was going to remain green. And we felt that we should show people how to build over the Edwards Aquifer rather than just avoid it, because building was inevitable. Well, one of the great things in my mind is that planning this place transformed what happened in this immediate area, but it's also changed the city. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. But at that moment in time when the board was facing this, and Mrs. Johnson took this very seriously, because these were her friends. I mean, in my mind, she's the mother of the environmental movement. To have your friends really attacking you. And in that meeting, she said, I can just see the epitaph on my tombstone now. It'll read, killed by friendly fire. And, you know, she had a way with words. Well, let's get back to our tour. The gallery, of course, has changed now. We have new exhibits in. But I think what it maintains that was always the idea was that it was a big pole barn. It was just a big barn of a building. Now, it happened to face northeast, which is absolutely the ideal solar orientation for lots of natural light. But Austin Code will not allow you to build a building like this with that much glass. And so we asked ourselves, how are we going to get lots of glass in this building and still meet the code? Well, the way we did it was connecting it underground to this building and calculating the natural light in this building and adding it to that one and then averaging them. So it wasn't what the code imagined we would do, but we made it work for us. And The other thing that we were really struggling with was, how do you bring air conditioning into a barn? Now, the engineers wanted to do the classic, you know, run the spiral tube through the space, blow air out. And we thought, that's just so unceremonious and doesn't mean anything. And when we looked at barns, we thought about stacking pitchforks and, you know, the different things up against the wall. And so we decided to do the ducts as these kind of tools that were leaned up against the barn wall. And I think it makes for a really interesting and unusual way to think about air conditioning a space. And of course, we also imagined what it might look like when the exhibits were out and it was used for an event like a wedding reception. And of course, you know, unabashedly took our inspiration from these beautiful old barns that you find all around the world. The area down below here, which connects the gallery to the auditorium, is slightly below grade. What had to be, you know, we have cut and fill rules in Austin. We could not cut more than 4 feet, not fill more than 4 feet, and getting all that to work out was a challenge. That meant that this part of the building is about 4 feet below grade. And so what we thought was, what a great opportunity. As kids, you would lie down on your belly and you'd look at the little bugs crawling through the grass and you'd really study the flowers. But as adults, we don't do that anymore. This has literally a sea of wildflowers that roll right up to the window. And so you can walk up there and you can see, it's like a big terrarium or a big ant farm. You can just watch all that happening. And so our goal was to, whenever we could, change your point of view. Get you off of just walking around looking at things in the way you always had and get you asking questions. When we first presented the design to the committee, Lucy Johnson, and those of you know her, she asked a lot of questions. And Lucy was like, what's that? What's that cistern? Why is that there? What's the aqueduct? What is it doing? Why is that arch off center? I mean, she just firing questions at us, and we're answering the questions, and finally she stops and she goes, I think I get it. We said, what's that? She goes, the place is designed to make you ask questions. And we said, bingo. Because the beginning of learning is questioning. When people question and they seek an answer, they remember it. When you feed them the answer without them asking the question, they don't care. And so a lot of the stuff is left to ask, and that's where you all come in, because you're the people who answer those questions. For years, and I'm on a crusade on this, I'm going to keep working on it, the staff keeps adding signs. And I keep saying, less signs. When you give someone the answer before they ask the question, you've lost the teaching moment. And so the best thing to do is have people like you who are equipped so that when someone asks you, you can begin to unpack for them the deeper meaning of this place. And I guess that's why I'm here doing this for you. You know, again, pretty unabashedly taking cues from cloistered walkways in ancient medieval buildings. In a lot of ways, this whole center is like a medieval complex. Happens to be one of my favorite periods of architecture. And then, of course, the aqueduct that runs across from the gallery and dumps water into the cistern. That actually was something we decided to do during construction. The original drawings, we had this gutter and we were carrying the water down through these poles underground and then back up into the cistern. And our project architect was out here one day and he said, you know, that's really stupid. We're only about 15 feet away from the cistern. Let's just reach out and dump the water over there. And interestingly, this is the image that Architecture magazine put on its cover when the Wildflower Center was published in 1995. It has that kind of tension because the cistern doesn't actually touch the cistern of Michelangelo's creation, where God and Adam are almost touching, and it's like electricity moves between that. And to be here on a day when it's raining and watch the water dump from that into the cistern to receive it is really a magical moment. The cistern, as I mentioned earlier, is an axis mundi. It's an ancient idea. And I remember giving a tour through here and to a group of students, and I overheard them walking up the tower, and one of the students turned to the other one and he said, you know, I went to my professor last week and I told him I wanted to write my thesis on axis mundi. And the professor said, it's irrelevant. Doesn't make any difference anymore. And he said, and I'm walking in one. He said, I think it's relevant. And I think he went back and told his professor, you know, you're wrong. It is important. And, you know, obviously the most famous of those was the Tower of Babel. Was an attempt to reach the heavens, again, a reflection of the importance of what happens above. And so this is an ancient form that's been handed down from generations that found its way to the Wildflower Center. Well, it also happens to be the largest cistern on the site. And part of the idea was that we would make it so you could look down in that cistern and see what the water level was. And if it's high, you know that we're in a time of plenty. And if it's low, you know that we're in a time of drought. You know, oftentimes cisterns, we don't know what's in them. They're just kind of these blank things, and we don't know what's going on. But this was an important way to demonstrate to people our connection, the connection between man and nature. The other thing was, we didn't really know how we were going to build this, because it's an ancient structure, and our structural engineers wanted to build a concrete frame and, you know, and then clad it with stone. And we said, no, let's build it the way the ancients would have. Let's just pile stuff up. And so we took the non-biodegradable spoils from the site that would have gone to the landfill, and we filled the tower up with them. So it's a vertical landfill. And it was another way to be responsive to preserving the earth. And the last thing is that people often ask about the little wooden pieces that stick out. That's where the scaffolding was, because they couldn't build a scaffold up the side of a tower that leans in and still be able to reach to lay the stone. So they built the scaffolding in the stone as they went. And their intention was to pull those pieces out at the end and plug them with stone. And when we got to the end, we said, it's cool, leave them, because it shows how the building was built, that this wood is sticking out, and you can see how it was done. The day this was finished, the masons had a huge celebration, because I think they thought they would never finish the tower. It took forever. And of course, the oculus once again reinforces this connection to the heavens. When it rains, the water comes right through and spills into the cistern. But it's also a really cool thing to stand on top of and listen and watch yourself down below. And, you know, pretty unabashed response to the Pantheon. Again, these are ancient ideas that resonate with us even to this day. And then this little tunnel piece, which is one of my personal favorite places at the Wildflower Center, the American Disabilities Act requires that you have to have the entire site be accessible to people who are wheelchair bound. And we set out for ourselves, most of the time those wheelchair ramps are really ugly and they're tacked on, and you kind of go, well, I guess they had to do it. We wanted the wheelchair pathway to be better than the ambulatory pathway. And so, you know, walking through this, I think, is a really magical thing, because as you emerge, you go in this side and you merge out here and you're looking at this archway, and that was designed as Mrs. Johnson's office. And symbolically, the idea for us was that you entered in, you were educated, you learned a lot, but before you got to go through this archway out into nature, into the nature trails, that you had to be educated, and that you went out under the watchful eye of Mrs. Johnson, which was, I think about her a lot when I'm in nature, that I feel like there is this sense of reverence that I have because of her, and that others, you know, even though people didn't know that was her office, for us symbolically was an important thing. I mentioned the cisterns. There's an extensive water harvesting system. Everything on this side is collected, goes to the main cistern, dumps down to an underground lift tank, is brought up to the large storage tank, and then distributed for irrigation. There is a demonstration piece here which dumps into the cistern at the little house, which gives the kids some water to play with, and then there are the portions that dump off here, and go to the entry cistern, and go to the wetland pond. And of course, the fountain, it's actually patterned after Jacob's Well, which is a natural water feature in central Texas, and it has that sense of the water just sort of welling up from the deep. Everywhere we could, we also tried to express the collection of water. So in this case, we tilted the roof back. We expressed the gutter along here so that you could see where water was being collected. That also had the added benefit, this is to the south, in the winter, by lifting it up, the winter sun comes in, heats this wall up, and then the wall emits heat into the space. It's a trom wall. In the summer, the sun's up high, as you see here, and it's completely shielded. How many of you know about these doors? A few of you? We engaged artisans throughout. Lars Stanley did the metal work. An artist by the name of Robert Foige carved these doors, and the idea was that every single panel was going to have a different native Texas wildflower. Well, we couldn't afford all of the carvings, although we still have hope and we still have the design, and he's still alive. But he carved the one bluebonnet that you see on there. And when we went to him, we said, what kind of wood do you envision these being made out of? And he said, cherry. And I said, well, that's great, except that there's no native cherry trees, and we're only using species from this region. I said, what about mesquite? And he was like, it's too hard. So a few weeks later, he was out in Lost Maples, and he was talking to these guys who had a mill out there, and the guy said, well, we have this kind of unusual tree. He said there were some cherry trees that grew up native in Lost Maples, and we're not quite sure how they got here or why they're here, but we take the ones that are felled in the storm and we mill them. And he said, we've got all this cherry wood that's native to Texas, but we're not quite sure what to do with it. And he's like, well, I know what to do with it. I'm going to make doors for the Wildflower Center. And so those are native cherry trees. So in case you didn't know there were native cherries in Texas, I didn't before that. Now we're getting into the informal garden, the seed silo. Obviously, the agrarian influence is now showing up. The library, still a public space, is done in the limestone. The public edge is done in limestone, and then the offices above and beyond are done in the galvanized corrugated metal. Very, ranching, pretty no-nonsense material that takes its inspiration from places like this. These very simple buildings that have their windmills and their cisterns and their barns, and this collection of buildings that make up what we think of as the hill country. And this passageway, this breezeway between the library and the administration building, as I mentioned before, is the way that you enter the nature trails, but also gives you this wonderful view back to the handicapped ramp. I didn't think about this at the time. This is really more based on the Texas dog trot, where breezes come through, and this is almost always a pleasant place to be because the breezes come through and it's very comfortable. But a friend came here and he said, I feel like I'm in Jerusalem. And I found this shot from Jerusalem, and I thought, yeah, I can see that. And again, I think what was going on here was there was a deep rooting of this place in things that were timeless, that have been a part of the psyche of man from the very beginning. One of the things that I find really unusual about the Wildflower Center, and I think it marks a very important moment in time. If you think about the history of shelter, why did man build? There's really only one reason to build. Man built to protect himself from nature. That's it. I think this is the first building that was built to protect nature from man. That's a huge shift. A major seed change in human history. To come to a moment when we realize that being good stewards of the earth, that we had to change the way we built and the way we thought about how we built. And so this mission statement of really protecting nature from man, modeling, educating, and then releasing people out into the landscape, I think is really at the heart of the mission of the Wildflower Center. And And when you think about, is this important work, and you think about where we are at this moment in history, never has it been more important than we take care that we are good stewards of the created order, and because it's in danger of being destroyed. And that's one of the things I think I take greatest pride in, is recognizing that the Wildflower Center was a moment in time that really was transformational, and I think for the entire planet. The library was designed immediately on axis with this elm tree, and the window took its shape from the tree itself, which kind of had branches that went out like that, and when you stand at the end, it frames that tree. I hope the tree lives forever. And you know, it was one of those things where you take the tree from the survey and you build the building based on the survey, and you hope it works, and it did. And then the demonstration plots. These have changed a little bit since they were built, but still I think have the same basic feeling. Again, an agrarian garden, not unlike what you see on farms all around the United States, gridded so as to make it easy to maintain and to change out. And then this, kind of brings it back around to you all, volunteers. Before we built the building, we had an army of volunteers out here on the land rescuing every plant that could be rescued. That meant if they found a little barrelhead cactus in the footprint of the building, it was dug up and saved and then replanted. And this is some of the replanting effort that took place after the building, or as the building was nearing completion. And the volunteers that did this, the project would never have gotten done without them. I should mention that when we started the project, we were told that the budget was between 7.1 and 8.1 million, that we had to hit somewhere in there. It came in when it bid at $7.7 million. And so we were well within the budget range. And then the committee came back and said, we can't raise that much money, you have to cut $1 million out. And they said, but don't change anything. And to cut $1 million out of an $8.1 million budget without changing anything is almost impossible. So we went to all the subs, and the Mason obviously being the biggest because he had the largest contract. And we said, we need your help. We're going to have to cut dollars out of this. And one of the things we came up with was cutting the stone out of the interior of this auditorium. It was worth $40,000. And so we accepted it. It was drawn with drywall or gypboard walls in it. And our mason pulled us aside and he said, don't tell this to the Wildflower Center. He said, but I'm going to figure out how to save $40,000 on the masonry and other places so we can build that. He said, it has to be stone. And so he did. This is stone because he figured out how to save money doing the other things he was doing. And one of the ways we did it is we told him, we said, we will never have you tear down a single bit of stonework you do. Nothing is wrong. We may change direction once you get going. We will be there frequently to make sure that you stay on track, but we will not make you redo your work. And because a lot of money is spent in architects coming out and going, I don't like exactly how that stone is. Would you tear that down? Well, it happens to be at the bottom of the wall and they've finished. We also did all the mock-ups that you've seen back in the work area by the greenhouses. And Mrs. Johnson reviewed every single one of those. Every stone, every mortar color, she was deeply, deeply concerned about the stonework. And so we got agreement on that. And we were able to save the money by working with the craftsmen and asking them for smarter ways to do things. Now, we did lose some things, which I still regret. We had operable windows everywhere, which we don't have now. Operable, you could open the windows in your offices, and that would have been a great thing. There are other things that we would have liked to have had that we didn't get. But I think by and large we were able to preserve the quality of the design. When the project finished, we were pretty surprised by the recognition it got. We started getting calls from lots of people, and one of them was David Dillon, major architecture writer for the Dallas Morning News, the New York Times. He said, "I've heard about the Wildflower Center. I want to come walk it with you." And he walked the site with us, and when we finished, we were walking out, and he said, "It's really too bad." And I said, "What?" You know, of course, we're like, "Oh, great. We're going to get this horrible article. We've just poured our lives into this, and he's going to pan it." He said, "It's just really too bad." And I said, "What, Dave?" And he said, "This will never happen again in your career." He said, "And you're much too young for it to happen now." And we said, "What's that?" And he said, "The fact that you did a great building," he said, "you'll do other great buildings." He said, "But you did a great building with a mission that is so prescient, that is so timely for a person in Mrs. Johnson who is so respected." He said, "To get those three things to align is almost impossible." And I think we realized that we had, at a very young age, been given a very, very rare opportunity. It was that year featured, as I mentioned, on the cover of Architecture magazine, which was the premier architectural publication in the world at the time, and you know, we only dreamed of ever making the cover. And much to my surprise, in 1995, when my World Book Encyclopedia yearbook showed up, back before it went online, I opened up the heading Architecture, and it said the most provocative project of the year was the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. The little Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. The only other project it mentioned in the heading of Architecture was the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame done by I.M. Pei. I.M. Pei and Overland Partners on the same page. It was like, wow. We had been given a really rare opportunity, and but I will say what was most rare about it was the opportunity to work with Mrs. Johnson. We worked together for 15 years on this center, and from the very beginning of her words, you know, make it look like God put it there, to the day that she died, she gave everything she had to this place. Her last breath was breathing life into this place. And after she had her stroke, she was out here one day with Shirley James, her assistant, and we'd become such good friends. And they rolled up to me, and Mrs. Johnson, as she would do at that point, you know, would look up, and she couldn't speak, and she would just clap and give you the biggest smile. And Shirley said to me, she goes, "Mrs. Johnson wants you to know that since she lost her voice, the place you created for her is her voice." Well, when she had her family memorial service, she chose to do it here. You never know what's going to happen with the place you design. Sorry, I've never gotten choked up doing this. I really miss her. But I was I was invited to be a part of that service, which I was surprised by. But I came, and I guess there was about 150 of us gathered in the gallery. And that year, spring just went on forever. And it was about this time of year. It was in June when she died, and the wildflowers were still blooming profusely in the meadow that we looked out over. And I remember she had chosen the scriptures to be read at her funeral, and she chose the Sermon on the Mount. And as my friend Steve Kinney, who I'd known from college, was officiating, Susan Godfrey, who had been the assistant to David Northington, the executive director of the Wildflower Center, was playing the piano, and we were gathered, and it really was a family. The words were read, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." And I had been hiking with my sons in Colorado a couple of weeks before, and I remember coming up over these beautiful trails and looking out over these fields of wildflowers and talking to them about Mrs. Johnson. And we remarked, we said, gosh, if Mrs. Johnson were to walk up to us on the trail, and she said, "Now don't walk on the wildflowers," or she started speaking to us about them, we would take it as authority. We would do what she told us to do. And I suspect that just about anybody in the world would have. And the other thing that had been said about her, and so put that here, and then come to the meek inherit the earth. Mrs. Johnson was one of the meekest people I've ever met. That doesn't mean she didn't have authority and she didn't have a strong opinion, but she was extremely meek. And as I looked out over that field, I realized how true those words were. That she had literally inherited the earth. And we were getting to use it. So, I'm still here, 18 years later. Still love this place. Now on the advisory council, which, if you know anything about architecture, it's really unusual for architects to become members of a board of the place they designed. Normally, you don't part very good friends because building things is hard work. But we brought it in at $7.1 million, not a penny over. And there were people making sure that it was not a penny over. And I think what the great thing about this place is that it really has furthered Mrs. Johnson's vision. It has become her voice. It has taken this idea that native plants are essential to the way we live and think and to who we are. As she said, if we didn't have our bluebonnets and our paintbrushes, would we still be Texans? And I think that could be true of any place in the world. That this place really gives us an identity of our own. One of my favorite philosophers is a guy by the name of Henry Nouwen, and he once said, if you speak in a language so that everyone will hear, no one cares. But if you speak with concern for only a few, the world will beat a path to your door to find out how you did it. And I think that's what the Wildflower Center is about. It speaks to this place, to the time when it was done, to the very, very specifics of what it means to build responsibly on this fragile landscape. And the world has beat a path to the door to figure out how to do it. Some of you know what LEED is, Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. This predates LEED. In fact, this was one of the projects that helped to birth LEED, because they watched our progress and then used us as a pilot and And now the Wildflower Center has birthed the Sustainable Sites Initiative, which is going to change the way we build on our land. We have been, from the beginning, in the forefront of the environmental movement. The Wildflower Center will continue to be. And these buildings are just a place that gets to happen.